She's
I was just doing all the
dinner's on
I was running fun. Same foot as a spider bar.
You don't, we've heard it 28
And he's
times,
heard it 28, he doesn't hear it anymore.
but it's a story.
But it got worse today.
Oh, no, I didn't hear that.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the joint meeting of the Sugarland Development Corporation, the governing body of the city of Sugarland and the Sugarland 4B Corporation. I'd like to call this meeting to order. City Secretary, do we have any comments from the public?
No, ma'am. And if we could get President Shul to call SL4B to order, please.
Right, so for October 5th, 2021, I'd like to call the Sugarland 4B Corporation meeting to order, 4 p.m.
And we have no public comments.
Okay,
Okay, item number 3, review of and discussion on the workforce and targeted industry analysis strategic project with the Sugarland Development Corporation and the Sugarland 4B Corporation. Alba Peñate Johnson, Business Development Manager, Devin Rodriguez, Assistant Director of Economic Development, and Chris Engel, Ernst & Young.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to be presenting part of our workforce and target industry analysis today. As an overview, this strategic project is the first phase of a 2-part process to update the Office of Economic Development strategic plan and will be used for recruitment efforts. In January of this year, an RFP was advertised, followed by received proposals being reviewed the following month. In April, City Council approved a $147,805 contract with Ernst & Young, and the analysis began in May. We will have a complete study by the end of this month. I will now turn it over to Chris Engel and John Reese with Ernst & Young for the presentation.
Thank you, Alba. Good afternoon. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it's good to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to present. Let me see here. Sorry, a second.
If you want to click once on the screen. There you go. Should be good to go, Chris.
Yeah, I'm just not sure how to click through this. I apologize. There. Okay. Well, hopefully you can see that and you can see me. My name is Chris Engel. I'm the Associate National Director for Economic Development with Ernst & Young. I'm joined by John Reese, our Director of Research, who will be presenting the second half of this presentation today. We're just thrilled to be working on this project and thrilled to be working on the team in the Economic Development Department. It's been a great project. It's been a long arc for us to be working with you after really working in the city of Sugarland many years ago, about 20 years ago. It's just been fantastic to see how much progress you all have made. So if I can get this working, let me just click through. Okay. We're first going to be presenting the workforce analysis and then getting into the target industry analysis. I just want to give you an overview. The workforce analysis it's really a 2-part project here. We're really about understanding the most important factor in site selection. It's been like that for many years. It really is about the workers that you have available to companies in your community and companies that you're seeking to recruit. So this project was intended to really do a deep dive into the workforce analysis. We also looked at a competitor benchmarking to see how you rate next to a basket of peers and local, as well as a few national competitors. We've evaluated your performance in terms of job creation. We also went out and did an employer survey, and asked them what they thought was working or not working related to workforce, why they were in Sugar Land. And we also did an evaluation of the education programs that are in Sugar Land as well as nearby, to see how that pipeline of graduates can support the industries that you're trying to recruit and retain. And then a specific analysis was done on the commuter flows in and out of the city of Sugar Land to see how well you serve your companies with your local workforce, and even more importantly, how much surplus workforce could you potentially use, offer to companies that want to locate and hire people locally. And a lot of commuters don't want to be commuting as much as they wanted to, after the pandemic. So that's an important aspect. And finally, that last bullet on the left, the entrepreneurial environment evaluation. We know that a lot of economic development is moving towards startup promotion, entrepreneurial promotion, innovation. It's not just about attraction, but really is about fostering an environment that allows entrepreneurs and startups to shine. The second half of this analysis is really diving into the industry clusters that you have, looking at various job growth metrics, something we call a location quotient, which is really a per capita concentration, helps us understand what we define as clusters. And then we moved into what we call a validation and selection of the target industries. And because it's more than what you have, it's really about the world around you and what's happening in these industries. We really did a dive into what we call market disruptors and trends, as well as looking at the local assets. So what's happening in e-commerce, what's happening around warehousing, what's happening in technology that's affecting these industries that could really be potentially an opportunity for you to get a stronger foot into some of these industries. And then the real depth of the report in this section is what we call profiles. We go into each industry's profiles and give you a lot of great content, not only about you, which can be used in your marketing and put on your website, but also strategic content that can help the economic development team really understand how to go to market and how to position Sugar Land relative to the competition. I believe we're going to stop for questions at the end, so I'll just we'll keep going. If there's anything important, or if for some reason the audio gives out, please interrupt me. The benchmarking, it's something that we do quite a bit for really all of our clients, because it's about understanding how you relate to the competition. So we, at a basic level, look at you versus Houston, Texas, and the US, but we're also looking at you against the Woodlands, Plano, Pearland, Cary, North Carolina, which is in the Raleigh-Durham Triangle, and then Sandy Springs, Georgia, which is on the north side of Atlanta. We looked at many metrics and really grouped them in 5 areas, prosperity, a lot of growth conditions, cost of living, cost of housing, wage levels and how they compare, momentum, a lot of, movement of people, movement of workers, quality of place. It's always very important to any company, any site selector, because that really drives the availability of talent. So those 5, pillars were how we organized a pretty extensive set of metric analysis. So let's get into it. Of course, we're just going to give you the best of the high points, we'll say. What's great about Sugar Land is just how affluent you are, and yet how affordable you are. So, we do use the word remarkably affluent, because that is the case, and affordable. So the poverty rate is very low in Sugar Land. And it's really about 1/4 the Texas average. A median household income is more than $127,000 a year, which makes Sugar Land sixth highest among cities in the population of 100,000 or more. So that's remarkable. Essentially number six, out of the U.S. And the median value is really less than $350,000, which certainly has probably changed a bit, in the past year. This is 2019 data, but it shows the ratio that you all are very high income and very reasonable costs. So you are at the bottom right corner of that chart, which is really where you want to be. And I think it's a great marketing message that can make good money and your dollars can go far in Sugar Land. So in our world, and economic development is all about jobs. We like to measure job growth. And so the last 5 years, these are numbers from 2015 to the midpoint average of 2020. Employment growth, rose by more than 14%. So that's great to see that you're creating jobs. This is twice the national average. And it puts you kind of in the middle of the basket of peers. So Plano, Sandy Springs, and Woodland are growing faster, but really not by much. You look at Pearland next door growing a bit slower, all right, we'll say, and Cary even less fast. But these are solid numbers. It's great to see. When you put that growth number next to the population growth, we see that Sugar Land's head count of people living in Sugar Land has only grown about 1.4%. And so that is a proxy for labor force growth, as well as, the availability of housing. So when you see these two numbers really diverge, it does give some concern, but it just really makes the point that, hey, Sugar Land's done a great job in areas that you really need, which is high growth jobs, and population has tended to trail. But of course you are getting less and less space to grow. So Pearland, in contrast, is growing tremendously in terms of population and housing, but they're still struggling to catch up with jobs. And so that's really a function of their growth cycle, in our opinion. So good numbers overall. Thank you for clicking ahead for me. Yeah. So let's see here. So this next slide is about, again, that the issue around housing. So it's not typically that an issue that falls inside an economic development department, but as I said, the ability to attract and retain workers, and particularly young workers, is very important. So Sugar Land is a very family-oriented community. 33% of all households have at least one child, and about 85% of all housing units are single-family homes. And so this is not a really diverse mix of housing, particularly when a lot of tech companies and a lot of the industries, you'd like to see want, or some of those, I would say those really high priced technology sectors really want to see housing and amenities that fit for a young professional, single, not quite ready to buy a house, wanting to buy some high quality rental property in a sort of mixed use environment. And so that's really what a lot of these high growth sectors and high tech workforce needs sectors really try to find. So again, looking at those two charts, we see Sugar Land is really high single family housing, but a very low young professional, so young population in terms of the total. So that's something to pay attention to in our view. So clicking, if you could click ahead for me, thank you. And so this employment to population ratio, is something that you then have to say, all right, so there are about 44 jobs for every 100 residents. And, despite the strong residential base, we're still seeing things like housing and construction slow down. And so Some of it is the lack of land available for that, certainly. Some of it is, that complexity and redevelopment issues, maybe more of a future for you in that residential area. So relatively low employment to population ratio, certainly low compared to Sandy Springs and Plano, Cary. You're about the same as the Woodlands, but a relatively low growth in housing permits, which is a proxy for housing. Next slide, please. So with the income and wages, back to that ratio, we really see that high income that was in the first chart we presented to you. The fact is that, you've got people living in Sugar Land that make a lot of money, but they actually work outside of the city. So average wages in Sugar Land are relatively low against your other benchmarks. So high income people living, commuting out to earn those salaries, but the jobs that you have inside the city are at the average to slightly below average level, about $57,000 a year. And so those are some of the ratios that we look at to really measure performance. And I think the benchmarking is really an indication of sort of strengths and weaknesses that can guide the selection of targets and priorities. I'm going to hand it over to John Reese, our research director, to get into some of the more detailed metrics on workforce. Go ahead, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chris talked earlier about sort of that combination of value and affluence as being, I think, one of the defining characteristics of Sugar Land. I also think the availability of talent really is a foundational characteristic of the community. Overall, it's a very highly educated community. About 60% of Sugar Land residents age 25 and older possess a bachelor's degree or higher. That's nearly twice the United States average. I think nationally it's about 1 in 3. So 60% is a really phenomenal number. And local employers have access not only obviously to individuals living within Sugar Land, but individuals throughout the greater Houston region. And so if you actually take a step out and look at a 30-minute drive time from Sugar Land, you have access to about 500,000 workers with a college degree, which really is phenomenal and blows away some of your peer and competitor communities such as Pearland or Woodlands, which is just a fraction of that figure, right? Where Pearland, you're looking at fewer than 100,000 individuals with a college degree living within a half an hour of the city. Woodlands is just 150,000. So that 500,000 individuals within 30 miles of, or 30-minute drive time of Sugar Land with a bachelor's degree or higher really is a phenomenal level. Also, you've got a relatively high proportion of residents employed with, enrolled in college. I think it's about 8%. So again, sort of almost on every metric that you look at when it comes to talent, Sugar Land really is a leader within the region and is a phenomenal asset when you're looking to recruit additional employers to the community. Next slide. I think another primary characteristic of the community is the fact that there really is limited overlap between individuals who live in Sugar Land and those who are employed within the community. So if you look, there's only about, this data is from a couple of years ago, immediately prior to the pandemic, only about 7,500 individuals living and working within Sugar Land. About 45,000 individuals who live in Sugar Land who commute out of the city to reach their place of employment. At the same time, you're importing about a little over 62,000 individuals who live outside of Sugar Land but commute into the city for their place of employment. Net, that means your daytime population is a little bit higher, let's say, than your nighttime population, just because of that influx of workers within the community. So again, on a net basis, you're a net importer of talent, but that varies dramatically depending on the specific skill sets and occupations. You can go to the next slide. And so this next slide shows the difference between individuals who live in Sugar Land and those who work here by occupation. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise if you think back at that overall wealth of talent we talked about earlier, the really high levels of educational attainment. You tend to export high skill, high wage earners, where there's areas like professional and technical services or management. You're basically providing much of that labor for the rest of the region because so many of those people live within your community. Same time, you're a retail hub through the region. But those individuals tend not to actually reside in Sugar Land. And so you're importing things like accommodation and food services, retail, a lot of teachers. Again, these tend to be lower skill, lower wage levels, individuals who might be able to afford housing within Sugar Land. And again, sort of exporting that higher skill, higher wage level talent. Next slide. And this is just the net numbers. This slide. Next, we looked at venture capital funding, which can be a pretty important component in supporting innovation and entrepreneurship in the community. This is one area with pretty limited and modest success. And during the previous 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, 18 venture capital deals totaling around $40 million. While that is higher than, let's say, the Woodlands or the Pearland, it really pales in comparison to some of these other communities like Cary or Sandy Springs, which, in Cary, you saw over $3 million or $3 billion in venture capital funding over the previous 5 years. Both Sandy Springs and Plano saw more than $1 billion in venture capital flows. Some of these are often really fueled by one or two blockbuster deals, but even in the absence of that, venture capital funding levels pretty, again, modest within Sugar Land. The funding that you do have, though, typically falls into areas like financial services, IT, and healthcare. Next slide. Another component, in addition to looking at a host of quantitative information on employment, on quality of life, there was also a business survey that we gave to local employers to gauge things like ease of hiring and accessibility of labor. I'm sure at this point we have all heard that nationally there's a pretty significant labor shortage in a lot of communities, impacting a lot of industries. I was surprised that this, when asked how they thought how difficult it would be to fill positions in the next 2 years versus pre-pandemic, that only about a little over half said either more difficult or much more difficult. I would have actually expected this to be even higher. I think in general, there is a feeling that Sugar Land, again, going back to how highly educated the community is, and that you benefit from being in a growing metropolitan area, that the ability to find workers is a little easier in Sugar Land than in a lot of communities. We've also, I think, fortunately seen employers really step up and get more engaged in ensuring that they're going to have the workforce necessary to thrive in the years ahead. I think one of the frustrations we've seen, let's say in the previous 5 or 10 years in a lot of communities, was how unengaged a lot of employers were in workforce development. When workers are plentiful, I think there's definitely a tendency to not be as invested as you need to be in a situation like we're in now. Most employers who said they were engaged in workforce education or other aligned organizations typically were involved in a 4-year college university or deployment or TIP agency. Next slide. Overall, when it comes to hiring, again, I think you are seen as a relatively easy place to either draw talent from or recruit talent to, whether it's in managerial positions such as senior managers and managers, or science and technology positions such as R&D science and engineers, software developers, and microbiologists and chemists. In general, again, going back to, I think, one of those sort of defining characteristics is that the quality of talent is good and you're often more affordable, particularly in comparison to other highly educated places on the coast, whether that's Massachusetts or California, is that there are, other highly educated communities in America. There are relatively few, however, that are as competitively priced, both from sort of a real estate standpoint, as we alluded to earlier with housing costs, but also from a labor standpoint, right? If you are in an environment in which housing costs is relatively affordable, you don't necessarily need to pay that premium to enable your workers to afford housing, which is definitely a competitive advantage, both having that access to labor, but also having it at a competitive price. So in general, employers viewed the labor market within Sugar Land favorably. Next slide. When it came to the sort of attributes that were viewed more positive when recruiting, again, going back to that cost of living being the most positively viewed, also I think this sort of reinforces that kind of family-friendly environment and characteristics we've alluded to earlier. The quality of the K through 12 system, I sort of is very high. A lot of retail options, just in general, a really good quality of life. And again, at a price that is relatively affordable. I was kind of surprised that some of like taxes weren't seen as quite favorably, just because in general, Texas has pretty reasonable taxes, particularly if you're coming from a Massachusetts or California, but maybe these were just a lot of local people. Next slide. All right. And so the next phase, I'm going to walk you through some of the employment dynamics that helped us select target industries moving forward. You can go to that next slide. And so one of the first steps in this process is to take sort of a step back and look at the overall performance of what we call broad industry clusters over the last 5 years. Try to identify areas that are growing and areas of strength. So looking from left to right on this chart, the farther to the left, I'm sorry, to the right a bubble is, the faster it experienced employment growth between 2015 and 2020. From bottom to top on that previous chart, the higher it is, the more relatively concentrated it is. Let's say for energy, for example, as a 3.0, that means you have 3 times as much employment in energy as the national average. So if the national average is 5% of people are employed in energy, you would have 15%. And so those higher areas, generally speaking, we want to see things in the upper right quadrant here. But anything above 1 typically suggests you have some inherent competitive advantage, which is why you've been able to develop that relative concentration. Again, this is one of the first filters we use when trying to identify target industries. This type of chart makes our job a lot easier because there is a lot of growth, right? Virtually everything on this chart is growing. And so we don't have to avoid selecting things that might be in decline. You've also got some really interesting mix of relatively concentrated industries, whether that's biomedical or research or professional services, which are sort of high skill, high wage jobs. Also industrial machinery and energy, where there's still some manufacturing strengths that are very notable. So overall, I think this is a very encouraging foundation from which to begin that target selection process. Next slide. Another thing we consider in that selection of target industries, again, I think Chris alluded to this earlier in the presentation, are macro disruptors and forces that we think are really going to define a lot of the performance of individual geographies, individual industries in the years ahead, and what communities are able to pursue and to experience growth and promote growth within specific industries. So the 3 that we looked at, you can go to the next slide, as far as those disruptors, the 3 broad categories were economic, demographic, and technological. And Bridges looked at a host of things, but economic, I think, to no one's surprise, the COVID pandemic and sort of the nature of the recovery are going to be a defining characteristic, I think, at the immediate term. Longer term, I think there's going to be a lot more discussions on sort of the nature of globalization and are there ways to make our supply chain more resilient so we don't have all the shortages and bottlenecks that we're currently suffering. And that may include sort of reshoring things back to America, or at least moving them closer, which could have some pretty big implications, particularly for our region like Houston, that is a big sort of trade hub. From a demographic perspective, again, sort of from a short to longer term, I think we're going to continue to see labor shortages in the immediate term, but some of these are going to be around for quite a while simply because of the aging of the population, which obviously is a potential drain, not only available labor, but will also fuel demand in a lot of services that support an older population. And it's going to be difficult, I think, for a lot of employers to sort of meet that. On top of that, you've got shifts in demand for office space due to things like remote work and hybrid work that may not remain at such an elevated level as they may currently be now or have been in the last 6 months, but are almost certainly going to be significantly higher than they were before the pandemic. And then finally, from a technology standpoint, everything from artificial intelligence and big data and data analytics to the emergence of blockchain and ongoing cybersecurity threats, I think are really going to become not only industries in their own right, but increasingly intertwined in everything from retail to healthcare. And so communities that do not have a labor force that are skilled in many of these technologies or going to have a hard time supporting some of their existing traditional legacy industries. So again, this is a pretty broad overview. The report goes into significantly more detail about some of these macro forces and industry-based disruptors. Next slide. And so the five, and again, that was one of the filtering processes. We also looked at things like national growth rates, local growth rates, both past and projected, your local assets, whether these industries typically provide a high wage level, and do you have the workforce to support that? And looking at all those filters and the ones we've just talked about, the five industries that we thought were best aligned with the community were advanced manufacturing, business and professional services, life science, information technology, and tourism. As we talked about earlier from that first slide, all industries, all these four or five industries have enjoyed pretty strong job growth within Sugar Land in recent years. And so that makes our life sort of a lot easier. From a workforce standpoint, you've got a great workforce, particularly at that higher skill level that will support things like business professional services and information and technology. But you also have the capacity to support occupations such as life sciences and advanced manufacturing, with the exception potentially of tourism. In general, these industries all pay very nice wage level, and you have the assets to support them to varying degrees. Next slide. And then again, the report goes into, I think, a lot more detail about each of these industries. But in addition to sort of the broad industry identification, we've also drilled down into specific niche areas where we think you've got a competitive advantage and given a little bit more detail on areas of pursuit moving forward. So in advanced manufacturing, for example, that only includes sort of clean energy and legacy energy operations, but also pharmaceutical manufacturing and computer and electronic product manufacturing, which I suppose you do have a bit of. In professional services, we see corporate headquarters and back offices, given some of your real estate assets, financial services, and engineering, again, going back to some of the strengths in the local workforce. From a life sciences perspective, you've got sort of traditional life sciences like healthcare and IT and biotech research, but also there may be opportunities to capture more healthcare services and to serve the broader region. That's not necessarily a traditional target, but if you can serve people living within that sort of, say, 30-minute drive time, there is an ability to support some pretty high-paying, interesting jobs within the life sciences space. On the information and technology, I think software, internet applications, and digital security are all projected to enjoy really strong job growth, both nationally and within particularly the Houston market. I think Sugar Land is well positioned to try to capture and support additional growth within those areas. And then finally, tourism. Again, you are a retail and hospitality hub. And so I think you're going to continue to see employment growth in areas like art, culture, and recreation, destination retail, and accommodation. So again, I think there's a really nice mix. It provides a lot of pathways depending on people with different skills, but also advances a lot of great things that we typically want to see in a community, whether it's capital investment in an area like advanced manufacturing or high wage, high growth opportunities in areas such as life sciences and information and technology. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you, John. So, and I'll just say one thing, we did go through quite a bit very quickly. I would expect you to have questions. There is a lot more detail in the report. It's very well supplied with data. I would expect some of you to be very thrilled by the amount of data we have provided you. And it's really meant to inform and direct the strategic efforts on the part of the city and the staff that in the EDC. And the point of this slide and what I'd like to underscore is that you really have a lot of opportunities in diverse industries. And you're at the stage in your development that you can begin to be more selective. So you have opportunities in manufacturing. Really, we're talking about smaller manufacturers, of course, very high tech driven. Business and professional has certainly been strong. Life science is going to be just such a huge part of the economy for many, many years. And given the profile of the skills of the workforce that live in Sugar Land and even some of the startups we're seeing around, in the Houston area, there's a real opportunity to play more of a role in this sector, I think, for the city. And IT, it's just, again, one of those foundational technologies that you've got startups in your backyard you're not aware of that are doing things that maybe they don't have employees or have a handful of people living in Sugar Land, but you've certainly got entrepreneurs living in your community. You just haven't quite seen the startups happen. Some of which is just there's not, some great, places and networking opportunities, but all of that can be addressed in the phase 2 work that you're doing, which is really about building the capacity to go seize these opportunities and understand how the product development of the city and everything that goes into it really matches what the needs of these industries are. So we'll pause there. Devin or Alba, I'm happy to hand it over to you to sort of facilitate any questions or just talk about next steps. Up to you.
So, yeah, okay, 1 second, and then we'll get to questions. I know probably there are a lot of questions, but thank you, John and Chris, for giving that overview. Again, this is just a snippet of the information that we have, and we're still working on concluding the remaining deliverables of the contract, but wanted to get this information in front of all of you. As a recap, this is a part 1 to a 2-part process that we're working on. So we've heard anecdotally as we've been doing our business attraction and expansion efforts of some of these things, but we didn't have that data to support it. And now we really do. We had kind of known about the life sciences thing, that we had a lot of that talent here because of a prior project we worked on, but we didn't really have that data ourselves. And so this has given us a lot of those tools now that we can immediately start some of those recruitment efforts that we were talking about, that we can use those sales points. I mean, just that image of the 501,000 people that have 4-year college degrees within a 30-minute drive time compared to other peers in the Houston region, I think is a huge statement for what Sugar Land has to offer a business. And the targeted industries that are being recommended, I think, really fit well with what we have continued to build here over the last 10 years, right? I mean, what the city has done to support tourism related type activities. You really see that now in a part of our diverse economy. So we wanted to get this in front of you guys. We will be finalizing these things, but just to kind of give you that snippet of there is more to come. So we have this information. We will then be looking at, okay, what are our next strategy? There's probably a million things that we could go in direction, but we need to prioritize what those will be. And one of my main things is we're probably going to be looking at what is our real estate strategy. We don't have a lot of land. So the land that we do have, what do we want to prioritize those for the specific targeted industries that we have? So all those to come. But with that, I think we'll be able to open it up to questions. So you go first, go right ahead.
Thanks, Chris. This is Stuart Jacobson from the 4A, right? DC. Chris, on an early slide, I thought it said that it showed that we had a very small population growth between 14 and 19, yet we had a very large annexation during that time.
It does account for the annexation.
It does account for
Yes,
that.
it does.
Okay, thank you.
That was my question.
On that note, does it take into the last numbers that it's got from the census? Thank you. Or our last census, or is that based on number prior?
John, what was the most recent census year for the population? Was it 20? Was it for the 2020 census or
John, you're on mute.
American Community Survey?
It's actually a separate program, census estimates, because the census hadn't been published at the time when we'd originally created these over the summer. And so the official 2020 census is kind of a separate program and doesn't align with any of the other data like the American Community Survey. So it is separate. So it goes to 2019.
And we'll get, I know a lot of these slides were some small images. We will get you guys this PDF so you can zoom in and look more closely at I think the location quotient chart that we have there. We can get that so you guys can zoom in on reads more closely.
Sorry if you couldn't see it all, but yeah, there's a lot more detail.
Let me make sure I understood the answer to Stuart's question. The increase of 1.4% in population is the increase in the pro forma population of new territory, Greatwood and Sugar Land annexed, or as a result of the annexation, we grew 1.4%.
From 2015 to 2020, including the annexation numbers, our population grew 1.4%.
Okay, that growth includes the totality of the annexation.
Correct.
Kevin, does it include or does it kind of not, because the annexation growth was more than a percent.
Yeah,
just-
it was
Yeah.
30, it was a 35%
Yeah,
increase
the
in one
pro
day.
forma
Yeah.
growth was 1.4%.
So, and I'll just say it is possible that the census missed it, but they do try to account for this. Like they have a program where they're constantly updating city boundaries to account for this. It is not perfect though.
And I'll say this too, I mean, with or without the annexation, I mean, the point, we would rather see numbers without an annexation because it shows apples to apples. And so we're trying to get a sense of to what extent are you creating jobs in the city? And to what extent are you adding rooftops, right? Or adding population? And so, you know, I think it's clear that you've done very well with creating jobs, but you know, the actual new construction, because again, back to the permits in the city being at the lowest level compared to the benchmarks, that's an area that has trailed. And so I think with or without the annexation, I think that storyline holds true.
Let me ask another question. Got a lot of city council members here. In fact, I don't know if any of you are missing. The strategy for the city, short-term, long-term, and its growth, and the complex of its growth. Does it fit or is it consistent with what he is telling us and what he's driven from his data? Should there be any surprise to any of you from the data? I would think not.
No.
And so I guess the real question, you know, going beyond this, and as you look at phase 2, is overlay this data with the strategy and then tell us what and where and how there ought to be some changes, or, you know, where we can maximize certain elements within that strategy. Does that make sense?
I think this is good information that we'd probably utilize in our fall retreat. City council gets together and we look for
It confirms a lot of things.
it.
Just one last question, please. As has been mentioned many times, we're almost built out. So are we still benchmarking fast growth cities with lots of land to build out on? I mean, Pearland and us are not exactly the same.
Pearland, no, in terms of the growth piece of it, but the other ones, Sandy Springs, Cary, Plano, those are others that are in a similar or more advanced in their growth as a city or age as a city. So selecting all the benchmarks wasn't perfect on every single kind of metric, but especially because we are so affluent. I mean, that was one of the big challenges when John, Chris, and Alba and I met. They were like, your income's so high, like you don't have a whole lot of options for other people to benchmark from it. So that pool of who our peers were very small. So no, definitely for Pearland, they have a lot more growth happen. But for those other peers, they are more closely aligned in terms of our growth.
So I'm guessing, you know, what my curiosity would be as this continues to develop is we have our footprint. Now, how do we optimize within the footprint?
And who do we target? And that's the whole
Right,
reason.
yeah.
We're targeting certain industries or professionals.
Right.
That we want to attract, and that's what Elizabeth.
and in relation to the peers, so regardless of how much land we have compared to Pearland, we still compete with them for projects. So us knowing their demographics and knowing information about them when we go to put our RFPs together, sometimes we're fortunate enough to know who we're competing against and we're able to position the information that way. So it's good in multiple facets.
Yeah, and I'll just add, one of the main reasons we included Pearland was because of their activity right now in the life sciences sector, and we share a lot of the same talent. They are just south of the med center. We are just, southwest of the med center. And so we are competing a lot when it comes to that cluster specifically. And going into this, we were pretty confident that we knew we were kind of going to be seeing that rise in the data, and we did. And so that was one of the reasons we wanted to include Pearland because of that similar in the competition.
Just one that's probably, well, maybe it's a question for you guys when you think about the strategy. One of the comments was that there isn't space or dwellings for young professionals that don't want to have a house. Yeah, I might want the professionals in, I want them buying houses. I don't want us building more apartments, living in this. The fact that a lot of people live here is the fact that we don't have lots of apartment space. And I think that's one of there's a pro and a con, I guess, because the affluent buy the houses and they don't want the apartment complexes all in Sugar Land. So I guess some of that's got to be taken into account when we look at the strategy.
Yeah, and not all, not all this data, there's a lot of this is a lot of data just for the recap. Imagine how all the other sets that we have as well. And so we're going to need to prioritize things. And, one of the other things, I don't know if it was covered or highlighted here, is that we have a lot of a tech workforce here, and a lot of those people are commuting out for those jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the talent that we have here that we could bring those types of companies here, and then people wouldn't be commuting out? And that's really a focus of where are we losing these people every day that are high income earners that we would much rather have that job here, and how can we create that opportunity here? And so that's really where more of our focus is.
Good, thank you.
Just to follow up on what Director Still said, just because you're a young professional doesn't mean that you hate houses or anything like that. Because a lot of people, even though they're young, instead of just putting that rent money, which is gone month after month, they like to put it into, equity into a house instead, so they have something to show for that.
Well, and they're all buying in the Heights because it's in walking distance of all the restaurants and the bars. My nephew is a perfect example, bought in the Heights because of that. It's a good location and what the surrounding community has.
But I think that's the reason Chris mentioned that it needs to have some high-end amenities for the professionals to stay here.
Definitely.
So not just any apartment, but high-end kind of, so they stay here and provide an urban setting.
But all this backs up into, again, I use the term strategy. Maybe it's not the right strategy, the right word, but who we are today needs to be overlaid with what we want to be 10, 20 years from now, and what we as a community with community finance or with other capabilities can invest in that will yield that type of growth. You build it, they will come. With regards to the industry and the complement. Within existing real estate, within existing housing, there's opportunities for redevelopment as well. Clearly, once you've used up all the land, you're going to go one way, and that's up with regards to housing. But with regards to commercial development, with regards to the hospitals, the medical services sector and all that, if that's part of the strategy, this is still a good time to make those investments, whether they're P3s or what have you.
Other questions? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, moving on, item number 4, contracts and agreements. Consideration of an action on authorization of a marketing contract between the Sugar Land Development Corporation, the Sugar Land 4B Corporation, and Development Counselors International LTD. Melissa Raju, Tourism and Visitor Services Manager, and Kat Saunders, DCI Senior Vice President, Client Strategy.
Good afternoon, board members. I am here to bring forward the consideration and action of a 12-month integrated marketing program for the Office of Economic Development, with DCI to continue to build off the foundational work. Here's some background to help us achieve our overall goal of strategically positioning Sugar Land as a location for business investment and an economic powerhouse. Next up. Since 2019, we have been outlining the plan to update the strategic plan. In summer of 2020, we launched a new website. In fall of 2020, you all approved DCI's FY21 contract to establish the foundational marketing work. And as you heard earlier, we intend to incorporate the phase 1 of the 2-phase workforce and target industry analysis into our overall marketing strategy. And DCI's year 2 contract will serve as part of a multi-tiered strategic approach for the positioning of the Office of Economic Development. Next slide, please. As a brief recap, here are the committed deliverables that will be executed in DCI's year 2 contract. Continue building off on foundational program, elevate 2022 public relations, marketing, and digital campaigns, position Sugar Land as a location of choice for business, talent, and visitors as the Texas economy recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, especially capitalizing on economic opportunities. Improve the Office of Economic Development's digital front door by adding content designed to address digital gaps identified during pandemic. Next slide, please. We will continue the momentum from year 1 by refreshing storylines. We will maximize media relations by continuing our proactive and reactive pitching. Next slide, please. We will continue to expand site selection consultant outreach, and we will generate leads with hyper-targeted digital advertising, such as the continuous activation of paid search campaigns and the optimization of our website. Next slide, please. We will continue to drive a positive conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn to engage and attract stakeholders. Next slide, please. Some of the new projects for this year's contract will include generating video content and news stories to drive traffic to our website. Next slide, please. And as you may recall from last month's workshops, you have for your consideration and action today a 12-month integrated marketing program with an overall cost of $361,540, of which 4A would be responsible for $170,770 and 4B for $190,770, which include an additional $20,000 to support marketing activations for Sugar Land's hospitality businesses, community like hotels, and our destination venues. Of note, on the contracted amount, $296,040 would be for professional services and will be paid monthly. And the $65,500, those are for hard costs, which are paid as they are utilized. The contract presented to you today will include similar services from year 1 and several new services like the video content creation, industry one-pagers, and website optimization. Next slide, please. Staff recommends the approval of a contract with DCI for a 12-month integrated marketing program. The total amount again is $361,540, of which 4A would be responsible for $170,770 and 4B for $190,770. Next slide, please. Next steps. So we brought the workshop to you on September 7th, and on September 15th, we held an SL4B workshop, and today we are bringing the contract consideration. So pending the decision today, the contract would begin as early as next week. And Kat Saunders is also on the call if you have any additional questions for DCI. Any questions? Next slide. Oh. Hi, Kat.
Hi, thanks everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there today, but I'm happy to answer or respond to any of the program elements or explain some of the changes if you have any additional questions.
I did have a question. It's not stated in any of the outreach and such. Does DCI, do we in the city of Sugar Land work with any outplacement companies that work with people that have been laid off and severed to highlight the city as a potential place to look for jobs. The only reason I do some part-time coaching in that realm, and it's just an area that if we had some type of partnership, that was on the previous agenda item when they talked about employers partnering with different groups. But I was just wondering, does the city talk to any of these companies to get them on the radar to have these outplacement companies even think of Sugar Land as a place for their outplaced employees that they're trying to help look for jobs?
Okay. We
Devin.
haven't done exactly that. We partnered with our employers, with our existing education, UH, our junior college, and those types of things to work on that workforce pipeline of getting people up into those jobs. And there's actually was quite a few things that went out today that I think there's a lot of might be some COVID dollars going into a lot of this workforce type stuff. So there's money coming in through the Texas Workforce Commission to help in this labor shortage of getting people hired on and incentives and stuff like that. So we've been helping in that realm, but not specifically to agencies that might be helping place.
Just something to think about.
We have had a couple of employers in the past that they are downsizing or laying off a large number. And in those cases, we have worked specifically with those companies to try to get their employees that will be affected other jobs in the community. So we've done it really on a specific basis with a local employer that we already have here in Sugar Land.
Just might be an opportunity to work with them.
Yeah.
As something, we can talk about it if you have any questions. Okay.
Yes, and I'd also just add that we always try and incorporate any types of job fairs or workforce training programs or any type of educational sessions that are available in the social media content that the Office of Economic Development distributes.
Stuart, I mean, Rashad.
I saw Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Didn't see Instagram. Is that a possibility? Because that's the younger generation. If we're talking workforce, we're talking about economic development, they tend to use Instagram more versus LinkedIn is definitely important. I don't think Twitter is as important, but it's there. But I think we're missing the Instagram portion.
So as part of our strategy, we activated our Twitter account this past year. So we're still kind of testing out how that continues to perform. And then we will revisit the option of incorporating an Instagram account. Does that help answer your question?
I'll make the motion to move.
Oh, I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Not a huge one. In reading the contract, on number 6, the term, it says the contract is effective on the last date of the dates executed by the parties and will continue in effect until all parties have completed their respective obligations under the contract. I don't see a termination date at all for the contract. Do we have is it a 1-year term or do we have a termination contract date?
So it would end at the end of the fiscal year. So if we were to approve it today, it would just, once it gets approved next week, and then we would end it at the end of fiscal year.
So we don't have to have a date in the contract?
Not necessarily. That's part of the standard legal the termination dates. It allows for the flexibility if we do need to terminate the contract beforehand.
It's when funding expires.
Okay.
Can I ask a question also? To any of you, and I don't know who would answer it, but I'm curious to know either today or a year from today, what's different in the approach and the marketing approach than you envisioned at the outset of the contract. As you go to virtual conferences, I guess, around the country these days and look at what other cities or other entities are doing that you profile from, what's changed or changing beyond the obvious? And are we adjusting to that change?
We are. Kat, do you want to try to take a stab at that question?
Sure, I can actually, this was actually an exercise that we all kind of lived together over the course of the last 12 months plus, which was finding things that were missing. And those are some of those items that have been identified to improve upon. in year 2. So things like where we might have done a site selector FAM tour, where you would bring in, say, 6 consultants and do some, fun activities, but also give them a great overview of available properties, available space, different infrastructure offerings. Now we've that is more of a one-on-one type of setup, where we're doing either single but mostly virtual one-on-one appointments for Director Huff to make a distinct connection with those people, along with the other members of her team, like Devin Rodriguez. We are also finding that industry one-pagers were something that was missing. We've added those into the contract. There was no way to kind of virtually deliver a quick overview of each of these target industry sectors. So we will be developing additional content there, where people will actually be able to make a conversion activity on the website and download an overview of the life sciences industry, of the advanced manufacturing industry. So those changes are being made. We are definitely adapting to the incoming trends that are happening. I actually appreciated the overview by EY on the kind of shifts in the economic landscape right now. And we're definitely adapting our marketing tactics to accommodate those trends.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kat. May I have a second?
Try again.
Okay, so the motion on the table is for the 4A SLDC to approve $170,770 to engage in a contract with the Development Counselors International Ltd. I have a motion by Kamali and a second by
Director
Watley.
On the name.
Can I show a hand vote to approve for SLDC? Okay, motion passes.
All right, now consideration and for the approval of the contract with DCI for $190,770 through the SL4B Corporation. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
By Director Hutchin, a second, Director Atkinson. And if I can do the same through a show of hands, I'll approve unanimously approve through the SL4B Corporation.
Clarification, Director Ferguson, were you an aye or an nay for SLDC?
I am an aye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kat.
Okay, item number 5, Director's Report. Elizabeth Huff, Director of Economic Development.
Slide, but real quick, DCI and the OE team successfully promoted Bluebonnet Nutrition's recent Sugarland expansion of 200 jobs and 18 million capital investment, and secured media results in national economic development trade publications like Business Facilities and Solutions, Expansion Solutions magazine. In the last 6 months, the overall Google paid media program has delivered nearly 400,000 impressions on search and display ads to target our key audiences outside of the Houston region. And then lastly, as part of the earned media work, which is proactively pitching media opportunities for OED, DCI has secured interest in a trip to Sugarland by a Forbes reporter interested in spotlighting the diverse food scene the city offers. And so we will get you more information on that once it's done, but just want to keep you updated. And then we do have some potential travel opportunities for our business recruitment efforts here in the next few months. So thanks, and I hope you have a good evening.
Diverse what scene? I missed the middle word.
Food.
Food scene.
Let me have the DC motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn by Jacobson for the SLDC.
4B.
And motion approved by the Sugarland 4B Corporation
Let's
at
go. National Night Out.
5:04.
Meeting. Yeah, she just, I asked her for it. Yeah, I asked her for it and she said, she just texted it.